5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey, space enthusiasts. We are talking about space sustainability this week. I sat down with an expert in the topic, Ian Christensen from the Secure World Foundation. A lot of the conversation is about space debris, but we also talk about some other interesting topics. Check it out. If you enjoy the podcast in general, a reminder, please leave us a review or rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple, so more people can find it. Thank you. As I mentioned last time, we just released a brand new MOOC about the space economy in collaboration with the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology Lausanne, EPFL, one of the world's most prestigious universities. There's a link in the episode notes. I think a lot of you will love this new online course. Now, as usual, here are a couple of short messages from our sponsors, and then please enjoy my conversation with Ian Christensen. My name is Raphael Rodkin, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by Nano Avionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with their CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu.
Welcome back, space enthusiasts. It's time for another episode. Our guest today, Ian Christensen. He's the Director of Private Sector Programs at the Secure World Foundation. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, Raphael. It's good to be here. How are you doing today?
Great. And I'm doing this from Washington, D.C., where I am at the Satellite Conference, one of the big annual space conferences. So, Ian, why don't you expand a little bit on that short introduction I gave of you, and including what is the Secure World Foundation?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll start there. So Secure World Foundation is a nonprofit organization or non-governmental organization, depending on the context, based in the U.S., offices in D.C., and my office is in Denver, Colorado. We focus broadly on the issue of space sustainability. And I think, Raphael, will probably talk a little bit more about what that issue set is. Mm-hmm. But at the high level, that is essentially how does the global community continue to operate in and benefit from a stable orbital environment. And so most of the work we do is about bringing together cooperative discussions around policy or operational issues that affect space sustainability and trying to develop cooperative and community solutions to those issues. My background academically, my training is in space policy. I'm part of the GW Space Policy Group and also ISU alumni from the summer session program in Beijing in 2007. Mm-hmm. Before working at Secure World, I spent a number of years working as a kind of business and market strategic consultant in the commercial space world, both advising companies on market forecasts and business plans, and then working with governments on how to leverage commercial space capabilities. At Secure World, taking that background, I focus on the commercial space industry and what that means for space sustainability.
Terrific. And by the way, what's the history of Secure World? Like, how did that start?
Yeah, so Secure World was established in the early 2000s, and we operate out of a private endowment. And our founders basically are interested in global stability, and they built up some personal wealth in the commercial real estate environment, and said we want to give back to the world, and so set up two different foundations. One of them is Secure World, and basically our founder Cinda Collins-Arsenault did some research and said nobody's really working on stability in the space domain, and I want to do that, and so. Hence, here we are.
That's great. That's a lot of foresight in the early 2000s.
Yeah, Cinda is an amazing person. So we were very fortunate to work for her.
And so, what made you? As you said, you've done a few other things and throughout your career history. What made you want to join Secure World Foundation?
The brief answer is that it's the coolest space policy organization in the community. So no, to be less flip, working in consulting, right? Got to see a lot of the change going on in the industry. Got to see a lot of the economic growth and the societal benefit that space capabilities provide. But consulting is a reactive industry, right? You're responding to clients' needs, and it got to the point where I wanted to do something a little more proactive and be involved in an organization that was out there trying to be more actively involved in bringing benefit and addressing challenge. And so the opportunity presented itself to move over to secure world, and I took it.
Great, and the rest, as they say, is history. So you brought up the key question before already. So what is space sustainability? How do you guys define that?
Yeah, so like I said, at the high level, it's about what is the benefit that space provides to us as a community, and how do we maintain that benefit through addressing a host of challenges in the orbital domain. So basically sustainability, right? How do you continue to operate in and use a domain for the things that you rely upon that domain for, while not damaging that domain for other uses and for the future? And so we're looking at that in the space context. And so that involves things like space situational awareness. How do you know what is going on, what other operators are doing, what objects are in space, addressing space debris policy. How do we mitigate existing debris objects and reduce the potential for future debris? It involves, being open and communication around national security uses of space and some of the offensive counter space developments, and making sure that we are aware of what's going on and try to reduce the potential for kinetic conflict in space. And it involves application policy. How do we access the data? How do we ensure that capacity exists across society to use space systems and their applications, and how do policymakers and regulators adapt to those applications? I hope that was useful. Could probably keep going, but anything.
It is, and there's actually quite a few things we can expand on, so that's very useful. It's funny on a very high level, and I don't know, it's a good comparison. It reminds me a little bit of like sometimes how people think about the oceans and making sure the oceans remain usable for humanity, and I guess it is another domain.
Yeah, well, and not only another domain, another commons domain, right? Where there is areas that are shared use, and we have to look at them from an international standpoint, not a purely domestic standpoint. Right?
Exactly, and you have the commercial angle, you have the military angle, and all of that. Okay, but so let's expand on some of the things you said. So you mentioned, for example, space debris, right? And we've actually had a few recent episodes with companies in that ecosystem, people who are doing like SSA, space situational awareness, or even active debris removal. A company like Luke from Clear Space was on a few episodes ago. So there's one aspect, which would be, we're talking about debris, which would be dealing with existing debris, right? And there's already a lot of stuff up there, as we all know. Depending on the size, it goes into like the millions of objects. So one, I guess, unanswered question that we still have about the active debris removal is, I just compared it to the oceans. And the oceans, I think both the orbits and the oceans are basically, unfortunately, examples of what we call the tragedy of the commons in economics, right? That like there's basically people are allowed to overuse it, and if everybody overuses it, then basically the outcome is non-ideal for everybody. And so related to that is one question with the active debris removal is, well, who's paying for it? Who's incentivized to pay for it? How do you guys think about it? Because I'm sure you guys have thought about it.
Yeah. So the answer currently is, right, nobody is incentivized to pay for it. Is the sad answer, right? And so when we talk about the debris problem, I often try to simplify it to two camps or two groups of debris, right? There's the existing objects, which I think Raphael, you started this question with, and then there's the what are we doing with new objects and how we're creating potentially more debris, right?
We got to that.
Yeah. So,
we got to the future debris.
Yeah. So a lot of the historical objects are government objects, right? And so who has the responsibility to pay for them? In theory, those governments. But what's the incentive for them to do that? We've not seen that yet. And what we are seeing is some governments, in particular in the UK, ESA, and JAXA in Japan, investing in technology development and initial kind of pilot contracts for active debris removal contracts, right? So ClearSpace, who you just mentioned, Luke, they have an ESA contract, and I believe they have no, they don't. Sorry, it's Astroscale, of course. Then has a Japanese government contract and a UK contract, right, to go after some debris objects. And those are great, useful pathfinders, right? They start to validate some technology. They start to show some demonstrated government interest in addressing this problem, but they don't move the numbers, right? I mean, one or two objects is a good start, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. And then the question is, okay, so how do you take those initial government pilot programs and expand them into commercial viability? And to me, that is where the question of the future objects comes in, right? So we're seeing all of these very large constellations, the OneWebs, the Starlinks, the Amazon Kuipers of the world, right? And some of those companies are beginning to work with at very low levels, very initial levels, with some of the active debris removal companies to at least demonstrate theoretical capability to have those satellites removed at their end of life if the design deorbit fails. And so that's the beginning of a market, potentially. And more significantly, if those constellations fly, they create economic value in low Earth orbit regimes where right now we don't necessarily have monetarily defined economic value, right? It's application benefit, it's societal benefit, but they're not widely used for large-scale commercial use. And so if you have economic value in the orbit itself, that maybe begins to solve the incentive problem of needing to pay for cleanup, right?
What do you think? Some people are trying to float approaches like sort of like a AAA type membership where everybody pays a small amount. Have you guys looked into that?
I haven't looked at that model specifically. It doesn't. First off, it wouldn't address the historical objects, right? Because it's already there, right? So it's do you have to pay to clean up the mistakes of the people that came before you, and that's always a tough sell. What we have been involved a little bit is there's an effort called the Space Sustainability Rating that was started under the World Economic Forum and then moved to MIT, and now is being kind of formalized and put to market with the EPFL Space Center in Switzerland. And that attempts to follow like the LEED green building model to say, here's various certification levels of your sustainability performance. And so that I believe will include some points, bonus points, if you will, for using or being designed to use active debris removal services. So it is one potential way in which you could design more market-facing inducements to encourage debris removal. See where that goes. It's been developed, and they're just bringing it to market, in the next year, I think.
And so, if we talk about avoiding future debris, if you continue talking about that, so where are we with regard to sort of approaches besides the one you just mentioned, Space Sustainability Index, of tackling that issue? Because I mean, there's a lot of ways we can think about, or approaches we can take, or maybe should take, like stuff ranging from. I think at some point in time there was a proposal in the US, which I think didn't make it in the end, that anybody who's operating below a certain orbital altitude needs to have propulsion, right? I mean, so there's potential legal avenues like that. Why don't we start there and then kind of explore some other things as well?
Yeah. So in the US, right, this is all regulated oddly under the Federal Communications Commission, which is where you go to get your spectrum license, and they have the debris mitigation requirement as part of that. They have tried to include some more stringent requirements. Industry has reacted to those, and a number of them did not move forward, but a number of them have. So one example, and without trying to get too detailed and wonky here, but the FCC introduced a new licensing category for commercial small satellite constellations, right? And they included in there some requirements that to qualify for this lower cost, faster licensing, you need to certify and demonstrate that you've registered your spacecraft with space tracking capabilities in the U.S. with the 18th Space Control Squadron, the military organization that does this, right? So requiring that operators, demonstrate that they're going to have active registration for SSA purposes. It also required certain maneuverability requirements, not propulsion, but maneuverability requirements, right? So small steps, right? The other thing that I think is important that we need to get a handle on in the regulatory and standards community is the idea that what we have now is a 25-year guideline, right? That your spacecraft, regardless of what its mission is, regardless of what orbit it is, needs to be either deorbited or moved to the graveyard orbit at 25 years, within 25 years of the end of mission. The idea that is a uniform, effective guideline for all types of space activities today is frankly not accurate, right? So we need to be able to move towards more specific guidelines and practices and requirements for specific orbital domains. And we're just beginning to get to that conversation, but it definitely needs to move along forward.
Yeah, and that specific lifetime guideline seems, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems simply like a leftover from the days of like when most satellites were like big TV geostationary broadcasting satellites with those sorts of lives.
Yeah, it was developed in that era, and it has not been updated in light of a much different environment that we have today, right?
Yes, there are many satellites, especially smaller satellites, have design lives of like 5 to 7 years.
Right. Yeah. So the business model, right? So the business model is to replace the satellites every 5 years. You don't want them in your constellation beyond that, right? So the regulatory community hasn't necessarily caught up with that practice.
And you started mentioning sort of like tracking space objects, and that people sharing data with the U.S. authorities. And where are we on space traffic management? Because if you compare sort of like to aviation traffic management, right, that's sort of very established on Earth, I think working relatively well. Compared to that, where are we in space? What's on the to-do list there?
We don't have anything that resembles aviation traffic management, and I don't know necessarily that we ever will. The physics are entirely different. The legal environment is entirely different, right? So there's some examples that can be taken from civil aviation, but I don't think it's the wholesale model that will apply to space. Where we are is that there's growing recognition that a more holistic approach to space traffic management is needed. Where we aren't is any agreement on what that holistic approach should look like. So there are domestic initiatives in the U.S. to develop space traffic management approaches, which is kind of caught up in congressional slow progress right now, but it's moved some of the functions from the DoD into the civil side of government and build a better public data catalog for SSA information, bring in commercial services. Europe has a number of initiatives going on around defining a European approach to space traffic management. What principles that will share with the U.S. approach is to be determined, and then there are conversations going on in Japan and elsewhere, and China is beginning to show some interest as well, right? So growing consensus that we need this, little consensus about what should be included in it.
I mean, it's, actually, and I'm aware and I fully agree that the comparison with air traffic management is obviously not perfect, but in some ways it's even scarier or more difficult, right? Because air traffic management, by and large, you're trying to avoid collisions between active objects, which of course we have in space. We have active satellites, but the problem in space, we have all of these non-active, non-cooperative objects in the form of debris, right? Or defunct satellites. So it makes it even more complex.
Right. And a large portion of them, we don't even know where they are, right? They're essentially untrackable. Right. Yet they're still, some of my contacts in the technical world refer to things as lethal non-trackables, right? Which is a fairly blunt term about what the potential of some of these objects are that we can't even see.
I find it's funny. It was recently in the news, right, with this spent rocket stage that crashed into the moon, and basically confusion that for quite a few days, I think nobody actually knew what that rocket stage was.
Was it SpaceX or was it Chinese? Right.
Chinese. Or, And so it kind of made it clear to me that that there really is this lack of knowledge. And then I was actually speaking to some people here at Satellite, and they're like, "Well, this actually happens all the time. It's just for some reason this time it got publicized." I'm like, "Okay."
Yeah, because it was
there's really scope to improve SSA.
Yeah, well, and if you're talking about cislunar or lunar orbits, there is most of the systems that we have are focused on LEO and GEO, right? And so you get beyond GEO, and the data is just very, very thin. So there's definitely need to, and we're definitely seeing a lot of commercial interest in the moon, right? And so it'd be nice to develop some of these capabilities alongside that interest.
And so the other thing, if I continue with the comparison with air traffic management, of course works very well because, for all I can tell, the international cooperation there is very established and functioning. Like just gets handed over from one air traffic control authority to another. How do you think this might work in space, especially now that unfortunately we're going to what seems like a much less cooperative world?
Yeah, I mean, I hope we're not going to a much less cooperative world, although there are some current events that would support that conclusion, unfortunately. So in the air traffic world, as I understand things, a lot of it is driven by standard, right? So that if you're a Chinese or a Brazilian or a U.S. Civil aviation operator, you go to these what are called SARPs, and they're very standardized practices that you can know will be followed regardless of who the other operators are, right? And standards can flow down to the regulation; they can flow down to the industry practice, right? I see a role for standards in the space operator world as well, right? And that is, can we get to the point where we have common protocols for operator to operator interaction when there's a conjunction, right? Right now, that is fairly informal, right? You call somebody, or you send an email, right, and say, we think we have a potential conjunction, we need to figure this out, right? Can we standardize that? Can we get to the ways that is, a common communication format, a common set of orbital information that you're sharing in that, right? And I think there are some, there's an organization called the Space Data Association, which focuses on GEO, and it's then they do some of this already, right? So there's some practice there. So that's one area. After that, can we then start talking about what are kind of rules of the road or right-of-way principles, right? So if you're in the conjunction where both of the objects are maneuverable, can we standardize the criteria in which operator moves, right? And how,
I was going to ask you about that. It's sort of like equivalent of like, in certain countries when you're at a road intersection, right? And there's no signs. It's like, oh, you're coming from the right, you've got a right of way, right? Do we have anything like that at the moment, or is it
we don't.
Like...
We don't, and I think it's something that can take some work, and it's going to take some operators sitting down in the room and having some difficult conversations between competitors, right? But I think we can get there. I think there's the economic interest in maintaining, the health of your asset that will encourage that. I think that we're going to see, as the number of potential conjunctions and collision warnings increase, that's going to become an operational burden on the operators. And that's going to be an incentive to try and find a more cost-effective way of solving this challenge. And so I think these sorts of trends will push towards figuring out some more systematized ways of dealing with this. But it's not going to be something that emerges tomorrow, and it's not going to be something that's like, we see an announcement from SpaceX and the Chinese that they've agreed to something, right? It's going to be slow, it's going to be gradual, and it's going to take a little bit of time, and hopefully it gets done before there's a catastrophic event, right?
But here you actually just gave me the next two questions I was going to ask. Because one is, how do you see this happen? Who is going to be driving this? Does this have to be driven, for example, by the UN, by UNOSA? Is it some industry association? Is it you guys, or how are we going to start making these conversations happen?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of things, right? I think it's going to come from the operator side up, right? I think operators are going to see increased costs to their operations from not having some standard practices, and that's going to drive some momentum from the operators to communicate amongst themselves and begin to figure some things out. It's also going to come from domestic regulatory and policy making action. So, and I would, with apologies, I would combine Europe as a quasi domestic in this case, right? So not Germany or France individually, but EU or ESA, right? So regulatory action in the U.S., policymaking action in the U.S., policymaking action in the EU, policymaking action in China, Japan, etc. So kind of a combination of streams that are going to work, informed of each other, but somewhat independently, and then through that, common principles are going to be developed. I then think those will be eventually, I don't want to say codified, but formalized a little bit at the international level. But I don't think it's an international top-down process. I don't think that is likely in the current climate. No.
Yes. So I mean, speaking of the current climate and potentially going towards a less cooperative world, at least the way it looks right now. I mean, we had the other sort of very unfortunate debris generating events is obviously anti-satellite tests, of which we had one by Russia end of last year, which now retrospectively makes a lot of sense in many ways. Is there anything we can do there? Any sort of like equivalent like we had, I think in the 50s and 60s, where eventually we got to like a ban on nuclear tests? And are there any efforts being made towards something like that?
Yeah, so there's something that has been started at the UN General Assembly, and as I move to it's called the Conference on Disarmament, that is the space security focus side of the UN. That's called, and this is so terrible. It's UN bureaucratic language, so it doesn't exactly demonstrate what it is initially. It's something called the Open-Ended Working Group on, I believe, space norms. I should go look that up. Open-Ended Working Group. Yeah, right. Which bureaucratic language, but they're
that's not incentivizing anybody.
No, but it's not actually open-ended when you get into it. It's open-ended in terms of a wide scope of topics that can be discussed, but it does have a timing mandate stuff. But anyway, without delving way deep into UN bureaucracy, this is a forum which has been set up to define essentially principles of responsible behavior by states in their space security actions. And so there will likely be discussion of ASAT testing and debris creation as part of that. Current events will see how effective that process is, but there's certainly interest in having that conversation. And I think it's also possible that you may see individual states take a leadership position and do things at the national level as kind of a forward-thinking leadership statement, and we'll see what happens there. But yeah, I think there is a window for discussion of this, what is responsible behavior by states in the space security environment, including ASAT and debris creation. I think there's a window for discussion of this and a meaningful discussion that we have not seen for a while. So I hope, I hope.
So
Yeah,
too.
let's just end it there. I hope. But I think there's a real window here. It was the current situation in Ukraine will affect it as it will affect any diplomatic engagement right now. But I think there's a window there. That act by Russia was just fundamentally irresponsible. And there's no other way to describe it. And there's recognition of that.
Yes. And some other countries have also made similar tests in the past.
They have, including the U.S., right? Including India and including China, right?
Yeah. So in this larger topic we've been discussing now debris for a while, is there any other sort of aspect that we haven't discussed that we should discuss in this this topic of debris mitigation?
So one of the other things that I think is interesting, kind of going back to markets and how incentives might play out, right? So one of the other things that we see developing is the satellite servicing environment, right? So the idea that you could go up and extend the life of a satellite, repair it, move it, if it fails to achieve operational orbit, move it to its orbit, right? And I think there are some interesting overlaps and complementarities between satellite servicing and debris removal, right? So that the incentive to develop satellite servicing capabilities may actually help us develop some capabilities that are relevant for debris removal and actually find markets that exist for servicing that might not exist for debris removal in the early.
Oh, absolutely. And the technical overlap is clear, right? So especially stuff like RPUD or rendezvous proximity ops and docking technologies are clearly relevant across these activities that you mentioned. Okay, no, that's a very fair point. And there's exciting startups for all of these activities, by the way. So shifting gear a little bit, so you've been talking quite a bit, or you've been using the expression orbits quite a bit. So keeping the orbits safe and everything, but it's not limited to the orbits, right? I mean, we're going to have a lot of lunar activity coming up if all goes well. I assume you guys are including the wider space environment, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I actually have a project I'm part of, the whole big group that's called that's looking at sustainable lunar governance, right? So that is very much a part of our definition of space sustainability. I've also done some work on space resources utilization and what does that mean? If we're going to start mining or extracting resources from the moon and asteroids, how do we do that in a way that is sustainable, safe, and reduces conflict and kind of solve some of the gaps that we have in international space law, right? So very much part of the scope.
Yeah, so if you start strip mining the moon, it's going to upset some people.
Right. I mean, it's got cultural significance, right? That is a very important thing. It's got scientific significance, right? That we have to balance that use. So and then our treaty system has some very fundamental principles, but operationalizing them in the lunar context is something that no one has a real good handle on yet. Meanwhile, missions are flying, right?
Yeah, so I was going to ask, what it actually means in practice when you guys are having these working groups and starting discussions. Kind of what kind of topics are you guys actually discussing? Where are you starting this conversation?
So one of the topics that's being discussed, I can pick a few, but in the lunar context is safety and safety zones, right? So if you're conducting a lunar operation, be it a scientific operation, be it an exploration, be it a commercial, how do you have a zone that you can define that is, I'm operating this, I need to have a little bit of ability to control this environment for safety of my operations and safety of other operators, yet still, respect that the governance system or the governance principles that we have call for freedom of access to the lunar surface and for non-appropriation of the lunar surface, right? So trying to figure out principles of safety zones is an active conversation that's in a lot of the space resources and lunar governance conversations. Whether there are some other examples that I can pick on. In the space resources context, we've talked a little bit about figuring out priority rights and resource rights regime. So if you're a Luxembourgish space mining company, the government of Luxembourg can say you have the right to extract those resources, but is the U.S. going to recognize that? Is China going to recognize that? Is Brazil going to recognize that, right? So beginning to figure out a way for countries to recognize the activities of others is a conversation that's going on in that realm as well. I say conversations because a lot of these things are still being discussed. Not much has been formalized or decided yet, but I think that's all right. We're trying not to get to the sense where we regulate before we have too much practice, right? So you got to find that balance.
Yeah, that's right. But on the other hand, I guess you'd also want to avoid, I don't know, people would have different views on that. I was going to say you want to avoid like a total like Wild West scenario, but then some people argue that the Wild West was economically very efficient.
Yeah, I mean, that's one argument. I was going to say the Wild West also allowed, if you were a small operator, also let the big guy to just come and steal your claim, right? Which is not particularly great for you either. So the Wild West is a evocative analogy to use. I'm not so sure it's a great one, but it certainly is evocative.
Yeah, it's somewhere on the spectrum of possible outcomes. Okay, cool. Let's see. So besides the moon, let's talk about some other aspects, I guess, of which are also related to all of this. Let me give you a complete curveball question.
Right.
This may come out of the blue for you, but I swear I've been interested in this for a while and I haven't gotten a good answer. So some people may know, also I suspect many people do not know, that when the space shuttle was first planned in the late 60s, beginning of the 70s, the plans were very ambitious. It was supposed to fly hundreds and hundreds of times per year. It's supposed to be a big fleet. And as a result, people expected the cost to be actually really low, the transport costs to space. I mean, actually comparable if you put it in today's dollars to something like we're only seeing now with like Falcon Heavy and things like that. As a consequence of that, people thought there would be all of these use cases already in the 70s, including space tourism and, of course, taking satellites and all of that. But one use case that was actually in the documents and people can check this was, we could take nuclear waste to space. And so I'm just bringing this up because, we are getting to a stage now where Starship works. It's going to be very cheap to go to space. I expect nuclear fission is going to make a comeback on Earth, again, partly because of the geopolitical situation. I mean, it's already happening. Yeah, is that something that ever came across your minds? And I don't know. How would you think about this?
Raphael, I may add to your list of people that don't give you an answer on this question. I can't say that it has ever crossed my mind. I mean, obviously, yeah, you're right. Starship, if it flies, is going to fundamentally change the nature of what the launch costs are, right? And do enable us to do some different things. Launching even nuclear power sources for spacecraft is a massive challenge, right? Yeah. A lot of regulatory barriers to even doing that. So I can't see that the U.S. or Europe or even China is going to jump towards launching waste. I think the public would have some severe reaction to that idea. So I don't see that immediately happening. And just kind of from a personal values standpoint, I mean, the idea that we would solve one waste problem by just dumping it into a different domain, I guess it's a feature of humanity, but it's not a particularly great one, right?
Yeah, although, in fact, okay, I don't want to dwell too much on this question. Thank you for playing along. It was more of a fun one. Although you would go into a domain that's completely irradiated.
Right, true. Yeah,
right.
True.
It's not like you're dumping it in like a tropical rainforest.
Very fair point, right? It's not dumping it into an environment where there's a lot of life that we know about that would be immediately affected by it, but true.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, super good point you brought up. I mean, there's already discussion of like when we eventually go to places like Mars, where obviously we've done robotic research, but that is obviously limited. There's this whole question of like if we actually encounter indigenous life, whatever form, how we deal with that. Is that something that's somewhere like on your list of topics as well? Because I guess that's sort of sustainability.
Yeah, I mean, for Secure World, that is not a huge focus, or it's not at all a focus for us. It's I don't know. In part because we don't do a lot with human space flight for our organization. It's not a focus area. So we haven't done too much in that area. I mean, there's COSPAR and planetary protection guidelines that begin to think about that. But no, I don't have anything intelligent to say on that one. Apologies.
No worries. Yeah. Sorry, first a nuclear waste question on this one.
That's good. I mean, stretch the mind, right? But yeah, the edit button might need it on that one.
So let's shift gears again, and I hope the next question is somewhere in the wheelhouse again. We want to talk about sustainability, right? Sometimes in finance, very often we use also the expression ESG, and then some people argue it's interchangeable, other people say it's not. But let's not get into that discussion. But so the environmental part is only one of the three letters, right? The E, and then you have the S and the S for social, and the G for governance. So how much are you guys doing with the S and the G parts? And then, as one example I could bring up here is diversity in the space sector, right? Which is still arguably lacking a lot.
Yeah, I would say we do more with the G than the S, but we do look at both of those in addition to the E. So for social and that part of ESG, a lot of, I would say, our work is focused on making sure our programs have the widest range of perspectives and viewpoints and diversity represented as is possible, given the nature of the program. So a lot of what we do is about bringing together people for dialogue, putting on workshops or panels, and we try to design those with the intent to bring in a range of perspectives. And that's because if you have the right range of perspectives in the room, you get to better answers, right? You get to better solutions. And so I view that as very integral to the way a good program is put together. On the governance side, right? I mean, we do a lot of work on policy and regulation, right? So that's governance in the system level. At the company, at the corporate level, right? It's kind of thinking about making sure that we can encourage companies to think about compliance and regulatory as part of the business plan from the operations from the get-go, right? It's thinking about how licensing and that process fits into what you're doing as a company, and that it's not something that you come to at the launch and go, oh, wait, we have to do this licensing stuff, that it's integrated into how you go. And it's thinking about, where new regulatory processes are required, how we can facilitate the conversations between the regulatory community and the corporate community to make sure that those regulatory solutions are designed in a way that facilitate inclusion in corporate governance practices. Felt like a somewhat incomplete answer, but I hope it gave a little bit of context.
No, certainly. And so related to that, I was curious how do you guys actually approach your work let's take, you were talking about the governance part, right? And how do you guys actually approach this in practice? Does that mean, for example, you guys are hanging out on Capitol Hill and try to speak to representatives or at the UN, or how is it all actually being done?
So I could talk about it. I mean, that'd be a conversation that could go for days because it's a wide range, even a small organization. So a lot of what we do a lot of work at the UN, right, and other multilateral organizations. So we are an observer at UN COPUOS, which is the UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. It's the UN body that deals with space governance on the civil side. So we participate there. We participate in things like the Group on Earth Observation, which is the multilateral or multi-governmental organization that deals with Earth observation policy. And so in forums like that, right, we are able to act as an observer. We are able to bring in kind of non-governmental civil society perspectives into those dialogues or into those forums. So that's one mode. Another mode is we will show up at a technical event or at a policy event and bring the other side of the conversation. So there's a large, I'm going to give you an example. There's a large technical conference on space situational awareness and observational technologies. It's called the Advanced Maui Optical Surveillance, or AMOS conference.
Sure, in Maui,
right? So we run a policy forum at that conference. So it is primarily a technical audience. It's the people that are building the systems, doing the modeling, etc. We bring in policymakers and have a conversation there about what take a particular issue and how the policy community and technical community need to interact on that issue. Give you one other example. I mentioned space resources. Trying to need to look at some of the legal gaps and figure out a framework to enable space resources development. We worked with a number of partner organizations to establish a group known as the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group, which was a mix of academic experts, government experts, industry experts, and civil society NGOs like us, and worked over 2 years to develop, or actually 4 years, to develop a set of principles that we think should be involved in any regulatory frameworks or policy frameworks for space resources, and recommended that to the international community. So it's facilitating an expert consultative process and then producing an outcome. I could keep going, but I don't want to get too arcane into things that don't have context. So
I think you've given some good examples of how you're doing the work in practice. So let me ask you this: so as a wider space community, right, other members of the space ecosystem, like startups, like people like me, like investors, right? How should we think about all of this? How can we help your work?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And I've got some thoughts, but I'd love to kind of hear your reaction to these as well. So specifically to venture investors, right? I mean, if the venture investment community is looking towards space as a new opportunity, and then the growth in the space sector, and potentially an expanding industrial sector, and seeing the opportunity there. I would ideally like to see space sustainability and space operational practice considered as a risk factor that's evaluated during the diligence process. So what are the risks to the domain and any particular company's involvement that might challenge or reduce the potential return and the potential growth of the space economy, and how can we think about investing in companies that are properly cognizant of those risks and acting to reduce them. So, what is a company's space debris mitigation plan if they're an operator? Is a company aware of their regulatory and compliance requirements as they go into their initial business planning and initial marketing? What does a company understand about the geopolitical risks that are involved in the space domain, right? I mean, I don't want to particularly pick on OneWeb, but I'm not sure that they anticipated that they'd have to move, that they'd have to, be kicked off their launch vehicle, right? That is a risk, right? So to the extent that these sorts of things can be considered and be aware of in kind of the deal flow process and the diligence process, I think there might be some opportunity there. Now, I mean, I do understand obviously that venture investment is about spreading risk over multiple investors or multiple investments, and seeing that some of them won't return and some of them will. But just building some awareness of this domain as it becomes a key part of, or becomes a key area of interest for a broadening investor base. I think there's some potential there, and I would be curious to see where that goes. That was part of your question, Rafael.
Okay. Well, let's take the break here, and let me. You were asking for my thoughts. So I tend to agree with that, and I kind of look at it both from a macro and a micro level. What do I mean by that? A macro level is sort of like, again, looking across space as an entire ecosystem, making sure that space continues to be a safe domain that allows commercial operations. Because I mean, the last thing we want is that it's an unsafe domain, that and commercial operations would no longer be possible or impacted by some catastrophic debris event or military activity or something like that. On a micro level, I think this is what you're talking about. So evaluating company by company that they're hopefully not doing anything that compromises the macro environment, but then also, as you were saying, evaluating what their risks are. I think we are doing that. I'm just speaking for my own firm. We're definitely doing that. I'm not sure we're doing it in the most systematic way possible. And sort of, if you guys at the foundation either already had or could develop some sort of standardized due diligence checklist, because I mean, some of the stuff is obvious, right? But there's going to be other stuff which is sort of less obvious. You know what I mean, right? So I think any sort of like document or help would be, and it could even be, if it doesn't exist yet, we could even sort of work on that together, by the way.
Yeah, so I think that'd be interesting. I mean, we have started some initial conversations with Secure World, and I've talked to a few other people in the community about I still don't quite know what to call it, but a primer or a checklist for responsible investment in space, right? And so it's something like that. I don't think that's the right title, right? But just a simple 10 points.
The open-ended list of sustainability.
The open-ended. I like that because I'm sure that will see a lot of uptake, right? But I mean, so that type of product, right? And Rafael, there are folks like yourself and others who are space savvy investors, right? Who know this market, who come to satellite, right? Mm-hmm. Who come to the Small Sat show in California, and then there are folks in firms that have one or two space deals right on the side of a deep tech fund, right? And they don't know the first thing about this domain, and they don't necessarily need to, right? So it's how do you make a resource that is available for that part of the community as well, right?
Mm-hmm. And which of course then helps lowering the bar for them, that they're actually are more likely to make investments in space. Right. So it's very valuable.
There's a risk, and maybe this is because I'm not deep in the investment world, but there's a risk that, hey, I'm going to make my first investment in a space company, and then that space company does something dumb and turns that investor off on the space world altogether, right? And I don't want to see that outcome either.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's the last thing we want, is some sort of a really bad thing happening in space investment. A lot of people lose money unnecessarily. That's just not going to be good for the ecosystem. Yeah. Cool. So we're coming towards the end here. So I wanted to give you a chance. I saw you guys are actually working on your own summit for, I think it's the Summit for Space Sustainability, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
What is that? What's going to happen at that summit?
Yeah, so the Summit for Space Sustainability is going to be in London, in the UK, June 22nd and June 23rd as a in-person event. So that's exciting. This is the fourth year we've done this summit, and it is our conference, and we try to bring together a cross-cutting section of the space community and explore how space sustainability issues affect different parts of our world. So we'll try to have panels that involve stakeholders that you usually would not see on the same panel to talk about how a certain issue flows across different parts of our world. It's basically, as we see space sustainability becoming more of a highly visible and highly salient issue, to make sure that we continue to push those conversations forward and provide a forum where industry, government, and the broader community can exchange viewpoints and develop some ideas towards solutions. So hope that you're able to attend, and that the audience on the podcast today is also able to attend. So
perfect. And there's probably your website, so we'll put that into the episode notes as well.
swfsummit.org, I believe is the swfsummit.org, and then we are pleased this year to be partnered with the United Kingdom Space Agency as our co-host.
Okay, terrific. Okay, it brings me to the final question, which I always ask, as you know, which is about science fiction. And there's arguably some situations in science fiction which are relevant to or related to space sustainability. We've been talking about the situation on the moon, and you have some of these Wild West type situations depicted in, like, for example, like in the movie Ad Astra. But anyway, it doesn't have to be what space sustainability is. The general question: do you like science fiction, and what are some of your favorite science fiction works?
I do indeed like science fiction. I think it'd be hard to operate in my world without at least having some appreciation for it, right? So I'll give you two answers. I'll give you the one that I most see in my work, and I'll give you the one that just most changed my perspective, if you will, right? I don't know that either of these will be too unique, but I'll give you both. So the one that I see a lot of in my work is, believe it or not, The Expanse, right? Some of the political structures that those authors were able to work into that series, I definitely could see playing out over time. The space resources questions and some of the that led to the differences between the belt and the inners, right? I could see some of that, maybe not at that scale, right? But I could see some of those equity questions and distribution questions playing out in the real world. So that one I could really apply, right, to some of the work that I was doing, and it's also just a great television adaptation. And then the other one that I always think about that just when I was reading this, I just put it down and went, whoa, that really changed my thinking. Is the three body problem, the Chinese trilogy, right? I don't I don't want to give much away, but it is well worth reading. The first book can be a little slow to get into, but once you get it going, it some of the anthropological, I guess, and cultural questions that series raises is it really challenges challenge the existing way I thought about some things, and so I really got a lot out of that series.
Yeah, that's I mean both of those I'm very partial to those. Long-time listeners will have I would have heard me mention that before, but people should watch The Expanse or read the books. But yeah, like you said, the TV adaptation is actually very, very good, and definitely also the three-body problem and the whole trilogy. It's three books. It's just absolutely amazing exploration of a number of topics, including how we would deal with alien contact, how alien contacts may deal with us.
Yeah, right. And it's it's not the typical way, right? To say that. So like I said, I don't think either of those are particularly unique, but there's a reason they're not unique, right? Because they say something and they mean something. So
yeah, and lastly, the last point I said is also the three-body problem was written by Cixin Liu, so a very prominent Chinese science fiction writer, and I think many of us may have only read sort of Western science fiction writers. So also from that regard, from having a different perspective, it's well worth reading it.
And my sense is that the translators did a pretty good job of maintaining the integrity of the text, right?
I have no way to judge. I hope so.
Fair point.
Good. Ian, thank you so much.
Indeed.
It was a really fascinating exploration of a little bit of a different topic than we've had so far, but I think well worthwhile. And hope the listeners think the same. And good luck with your work at the foundation.
Well, Raphael, thanks for having me, and it made me think about some things differently as well. So that's excellent. So appreciate it.
Thanks.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.